They chose my granddaughter's baptism to cut me loose. That is the truth I have replayed in my mind 1,000 times, because cruelty always feels sharper when it dresses itself as holiness. I was standing in the second pew of St. Matthew's Church, my knees aching, my hands wrapped around a white knitted blanket I had finished late into the night. Every stitch carried a memory. I had knitted the same way when my daughter was a baby, sitting on the porch of our farm, listening to the wind move through acres of land my late husband and I had built from nothing. The priest smiled. The choir sang. My granddaughter was lifted toward the baptismal font, her tiny face calm, unaware of the quiet fracture already forming beneath our family. People turned and smiled at me. I was the grandmother, the proud one, the woman who had sold everything so her child could live in a house with tall windows and polished floors. That house had cost $1.2 million. Every dollar came from the sale of the farm my husband left behind when he died. After the ceremony, as guests gathered their coats and whispered congratulations, my daughter touched my arm. Her hand felt unfamiliar light, as if she were afraid of leaving fingerprints. "Mom, can we talk outside for a moment?" she asked. Her husband followed us without a word. His face was blank, polite, distant. I remember thinking he looked like a man waiting for a bus he hoped would arrive quickly. The cold air hit my face as we stepped onto the church steps. The bells began to ring sharp and bright, echoing in my chest. My daughter crossed her arms, a gesture I recognized from her teenage years. It meant she had already decided. "We've been talking," she said, "and from now on we think it's best if you don't live with us anymore." The words landed slowly like snow that turns into ice once it settles. I waited for her to explain, for a reason, for a thank you. None came. Her husband cleared his throat. "It's about space," he said, "and boundaries." Boundaries, a word people use when they want to push you away without admitting they are ashamed. I felt my mouth curved into a smile I did not recognize. Shock can do that. It keeps you upright when your legs want to fold. "I bought that house so you could have a future," I said quietly. She looked past me toward the parking lot. "We appreciate everything you've done, Mom, but this is what's best for our family." Our family. As if I were already outside of it. I asked one question. "When?" She hesitated. "Soon. We think it would be better if you made arrangements." The bells kept ringing. Guests walked past us laughing, unaware that a woman's life had just been dismantled between prayers. I nodded. I hugged my granddaughter. I congratulated my daughter. I walked to my car with the blanket still folded over my arm. As I drove away from the church, one thought pressed against my chest harder than grief. How did love turn into something so easily discarded? And why did they choose today? I slept in my car that night, parked behind a grocery store I had shopped at for decades. The sign buzzed softly above me, the kind of sound you notice only when you are alone with your thoughts. I could have gone to a friend's house. I could have checked into a hotel. But my hands stayed on the steering wheel long after the engine went cold. I kept seeing my daughter's face, calm, certain, as if removing me were a practical decision like replacing old furniture. My husband would have never allowed this. That thought arrived suddenly, painfully. He had protected our family with his body, his labor, his silence. When he died, the farm became my last tie to him. The land held our history, our sacrifices, our love. And I sold it. I sold it so my daughter could live comfortably, so her children would have rooms filled with light instead of dust. I told myself it was an inheritance given early in act of generosity rooted in trust. The lawyer had warned me. I remembered his careful tone, the way he slid the papers across the desk. "You're sure you don't want your name on the deed?" he asked. I shook my head. She's my daughter. That night, lying in the back seat of my car, I understood what he had really been asking. Trust without protection is faith, and faith can be exploited. The next morning, I checked into a small roadside motel. The curtains smelled faintly of detergent. The coffee tasted thin. The woman at the desk smiled at me like she had seen this story before and knew better than to ask questions. I left my bags in the room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the patterned carpet. My hands were steady now. The shock had worn off. Something else was taking its place. Clarity. I called my daughter. It went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. I called my sister instead. She listened without interrupting, her silence heavier than sympathy. Finally, she asked, "Do you have anything in writing?" The question echoed through me. Deeds, transfers, agreements I had never asked for because love had felt enough. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not the same one, a different firm, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who did not soften her words. She listened. She took notes. She asked careful questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something that shifted the ground beneath me. Being generous doesn't mean you gave up your dignity. We need to look closely at how that house was funded. I walked out of her office feeling lighter and heavier all at once. Because betrayal hurts, but injustice demands an answer. And for the first time since the church bells rang, I understood something clearly. I was done being quiet. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish. It was the kind of place where secrets went to be unfolded carefully, one document at a time. I sat across from her desk, my hands folded, my posture straight the way women of my generation were taught to sit when something mattered. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was a grandmother, too. I noticed the photo on her bookshelf before I noticed anything else. That mattered to me more than her degrees. She asked me to start from the beginning, so I told her about the farm, about the years my husband and I spent waking before dawn about winters, where our fingers went numb but we kept working because land has a way of rewarding patience. I told her how after he died, the farm felt too quiet, too full of ghosts, and how my daughter cried at my kitchen table, worried about raising a family without security. I told her I sold the land so my daughter could have a home, not a loan, not an investment, a gift rooted in love. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she slid a yellow pad toward herself and tapped her pen against it. "Did you sign a gift letter?" she asked. I shook my head. "Was the money transferred directly to the seller or to your daughter's account?" "To the seller," I said, at closing. She nodded slowly. "And you lived in the house?" "Yes, from the beginning." "How long?" "Almost 4 years." She leaned back. "Then this is not as simple as they think." Those words landed softly, but they carried weight. For the first time since the baptism, I felt something other than humiliation. Hope. She explained things carefully. Constructive trust, unjust enrichment, verbal agreements that courts sometimes recognize when actions support intent. She spoke about how money, when traced, clearly leaves fingerprints. "What your daughter did may feel personal," she said. "But the law looks at behavior, not emotions." I smiled at that. I had lived my life believing emotions were everything. Now I was learning they were not enough. That evening I drove past the house. I told myself it was accidental. It was not. The lights were on. The curtains I had chosen still hung in the living room. I could see movement inside, laughter, life continuing without me. I sat in my car and let myself feel it. The ache, the betrayal, the quiet fury that comes when a woman realizes her kindness has been mistaken for weakness. I did not knock. I did not call. Instead, I went back to the motel and opened a box I had carried with me since leaving the farm. Inside were old files, bank statements, closing documents, receipts I had never thought I would need again. That night, I began organizing my life the way I once organized harvest seasons, with intention, with patience, with purpose. They thought I would fade quietly. They had no idea what they had awakened. The first letter arrived a week later. It was polite, formal, carefully worded. My daughter's husband had hired an attorney. The letter stated that my temporary stay in their home had ended and that I was expected to retrieve my remaining belongings by a specified date. Temporary. As if I had been a guest in a house built with my sacrifice. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the desk beside Margaret's business card. Margaret was not surprised. "This is common," she said when I showed it to her. "They're trying to establish a narrative." I laughed then, a short, humorless sound. They should have asked me before choosing one. She began drafting a response that afternoon. It did not accuse, it did not threaten, it asked questions. Clear, pointed questions about funding, intent, and occupancy. Questions that required answers supported by evidence. While she worked, I sat quietly and watched the city through the window. I noticed things I had ignored for years. How many women my age walked alone? How many carried stories no one had asked to hear? When I left her office, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a witness to my own life, finally ready to testify. At the motel, I received a message from my daughter. It was brief. "We don't want this to get ugly." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Neither do I. I just want what's fair." She did not respond. Days passed. Then another letter arrived, this one less polite, more defensive. They denied everything, claimed the money was a gift with no conditions, claimed I had overstayed my welcome. Margaret read it and nodded. "Good," she said. "Good," I asked. "Yes, they're nervous." I thought of my granddaughter, of her tiny hands wrapped around my finger. I thought of the baptism water still drying on her forehead when my daughter told me to leave. This was not revenge, not yet. This was reckoning. And reckoning has a way of spreading, touching every corner of a life built on silence. That night, as I lay in the motel bed, I realized something else. They had underestimated me because they only knew the version of me that gave. They had never met the version that endured, and soon they would. The silence from my daughter lasted nearly 3 weeks. In that time, my life settled into a rhythm I never expected to learn at this age. Mornings at the motel, afternoons at Margaret's office or the public library, evenings walking slowly through a nearby park, watching families who still believed love was permanent. I was not hiding, I was preparing. Margaret asked me to write everything down. Dates, conversations, promises spoken casually over dinner that had suddenly become inconvenient truths. I wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about the night my daughter cried and asked me to help her buy the house. I wrote about her husband shaking my hand afterward, thanking me for saving their future. I wrote about the spare bedroom they insisted was mine, the one I painted myself. Memory became evidence. One afternoon, Margaret received financial records from the title company. She spread them across the desk like a deck of cards and smiled faintly. "This is important," she said. "The money went directly from your account to the seller. There was no intermediary, no gift letter, no tax filing declaring it as such." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the story they're telling doesn't match the paper trail." For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine something other than loss. Not victory, not punishment, just balance. That night, my phone rang. My daughter's name lit up the screen. I answered. "Mom," she said quickly, "why are you doing this?" The question stunned me, not because she asked it, but because she truly seemed confused. "I'm asking for fairness," I said. "That house exists because of me." She sighed. "You never said there were strings." "There were no strings," I replied. "There was trust." Her husband's voice came through the line, distant but sharp. "This is turning into a legal mess." I closed my eyes. "You turned it into that when you told me to leave with nothing." Silence followed. Then my daughter spoke again, quieter this time. "We thought you'd understand." Understand what? That love expires, that sacrifice is forgettable, that mothers are expected to disappear once their usefulness ends. "I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand who you are now." The call ended without goodbye. 2 days later, Margaret filed the claim. It wasn't dramatic. No courthouse steps, no raised voices. Just a formal document asserting that the house had been purchased with my funds under an implied agreement of shared residence and security. I watched Margaret sign her name and felt something tighten in my chest. This was real now. That evening, I cried for the first time since the baptism. Not loudly, not desperately, just enough to release the weight I had been carrying alone. I cried for the daughter I thought I had. I cried for the woman I had been. And when I was done, I slept deeply. The backlash came swiftly. Friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Someone from church sent a message suggesting family matters should stay private. I read it twice, then deleted it without replying. Privacy is a luxury afforded to those not being erased. Margaret warned me this would happen. "They will try to make you look unreasonable," she said. "Ungrateful. Difficult." I smiled. Women like me are always called difficult when we stop agreeing. Depositions were scheduled, documents exchanged. The process moved slowly, but every step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Then came the first crack in their story. Their lawyer requested a delay. Margaret raised an eyebrow when she read the notice. "That's interesting," she said. "People delay when they're scrambling." We learned why a week later. The house had been refinanced, quietly, without telling me. My daughter and her husband had taken out a loan against the equity I had created. Margaret's jaw tightened. "This complicates things for them," she said. "They treated the house like an asset they alone owned." I felt anger then. Clean and sharp, not wild, not reckless. The kind of anger that brings clarity. "They never thought I'd fight," I said. "No," Margaret agreed. "They thought you'd disappear." The court date was set for early fall. The leaves were already beginning to turn. I noticed it one morning as I walked past a row of trees near the motel. Change was happening everywhere, not just in my life. On the eve of the hearing, I received a letter, not from a lawyer, from my daughter. She wrote about stress, about the baby, about misunderstanding. She asked if we could find another way. I read it slowly, then folded it and placed it in my bag. There was another way, but it was no longer mine to offer. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The judge older, female. She looked at me over her glasses and nodded slightly when I took my seat. As the lawyers spoke, I listened. I watched my daughter avoid my eyes. I watched her husband fidget. When Margaret stood, she spoke calmly. She told my story without emotion, letting the facts carry their own weight. When it was my turn, the judge asked one question. "Why did you sell the farm?" I answered honestly, "Because I believed taking care of my child would mean I would never be abandoned." The courtroom was silent. In that moment, I knew something irreversible had occurred. Not because of the law, but because I had finally told the truth out loud. And truth once spoken cannot be sent back into silence. The judge did not rule that day. She rarely did. Instead, she requested additional documentation and scheduled a follow-up hearing. To some people, that would have felt like delay. To me, it felt like momentum. Because I saw something in my daughter's face as we stood to leave the courtroom. Not anger, not defiance, fear. Outside, autumn air cut through my coat. My daughter lingered near the steps, clearly waiting. Her husband stayed behind, speaking urgently into his phone. "Mom," she said, lowering her voice, "we never wanted it to go this far." I looked at her. Really looked. The lines around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. She looked older than I remembered. So did I. "It didn't go far," I said. "You pushed it." She swallowed. "We assumed you'd stay quiet. You always do." There it was, the truth hiding behind years of politeness. "I stayed quiet because I thought that was love," I said. "Now I know better." She reached for my arm. I stepped back. That night, Margaret called me at the motel. "They're nervous," she said again, but this time her voice carried certainty. "Your daughter's husband has business issues. Debts. The refinance was not just convenience." "Does that matter?" I asked. "It does when the house becomes collateral," she replied, "and when the source of that equity is questioned." Over the next weeks, more information surfaced. Credit lines, missed payments, a failed investment my daughter had never mentioned. The house was not just a home, it was their safety net, and they had tried to cut me out of it. Friends from church eventually reached out, carefully, quietly, asking if the rumors were true. I told them the truth without drama. Some looked uncomfortable, some apologized. A few surprised me by standing firmly at my side. One woman, widowed like me, squeezed my hand and said, "They always forget who paid the price." At night, I thought about my granddaughter. I worried about what this would mean for her future. But then I reminded myself of something important. Children learn not from what we say, but from what we tolerate. The second hearing arrived with gray skies and heavy air. This time the courtroom felt different, tighter, charged. Margaret presented evidence clearly. The farm sale, the direct transfer, my residency, the absence of any documentation calling the money a gift. The opposing lawyer's tone softened. He spoke of family, of intention, of misunderstanding. The judge listened. Then she turned to my daughter. "Why was your mother asked to leave?" she asked. My daughter hesitated, looked at her husband, then back at the judge. "We needed space," she said. The judge nodded slowly. Space is not a legal justification for unjust enrichment. That phrase echoed through me. Unjust enrichment. For the first time, I saw my daughter flinch. The ruling came 3 weeks later. Margaret called me early in the morning. "We won," she said simply. I sat on the edge of the bed phone, pressed to my ear, the motel curtains glowing softly with morning light. The court determined that the funds used to purchase the house created a constructive trust in my favor. The judge ruled that my daughter and her husband had benefited unfairly from my sacrifice, while attempting to exclude me from its security. The house was to be sold. The proceeds would be divided according to contribution. Mine recognized. Legally. Publicly. I felt no triumph, only relief. My daughter did not call. Her husband did. His voice was strained, brittle. "This didn't have to happen," he said. "It happened because you chose comfort over conscience," I replied. When the house went on the market, neighbors whispered. Friends speculated. Church conversations shifted. I moved out of the motel and into a small rental near the park. It was modest, quiet, mine. The day the house sold, Margaret handed me the final paperwork. I stared at my name on the page longer than necessary. "You did more than recover money," she said. "You reclaimed yourself." I nodded. Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, my daughter knocked on my door, alone. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. "I'm sorry," she said, not dramatically, not perfectly, but honestly. I listened. I did not rush to forgive. I did not slam the door. We spoke carefully, about boundaries, about accountability, about how love does not erase responsibility. I told her something she needed to hear. Being a mother does not mean being disposable. She cried then. I held her, because forgiveness is not weakness, it is choice. But I did not give back what I had fought to regain. I invested my share wisely. I planned for my future. I volunteered, I traveled, I lived. At my granddaughter's first birthday, I stood in the background and watched her laugh. I felt peace. Because revenge is not about destruction. It is about balance restored, dignity reclaimed, and a woman remembering her worth. If this story resonated with you, Take a moment to reflect on your own boundaries. Share your thoughts. And if you believe stories like this matter, stay with us. Some truths deserve to be heard. Peace did not arrive all at once. It never does. It came in small, cautious moments, the way trust returns after it has been broken too completely to rush. I settled into my new routine slowly. Mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons volunteering at a local food pantry where no one knew my story and no one needed to. Evenings were the hardest. Silence has a way of asking questions you cannot ignore. My daughter kept her distance after the settlement. She sent photos of my granddaughter, short updates, neutral words. I answered politely, kindly, but I no longer bent myself into the shape she needed. Then one afternoon, Margaret called me again. Her tone was different this time. Curious, careful. "There's something you should know," she said. "Your son-in-law's business is under investigation." I closed my eyes, not out of satisfaction, out of exhaustion. It turned out the debts we had uncovered were only the surface. There were misrepresentations. Funds moved in ways that did not match the stories told to lenders. The refinance of the house had triggered scrutiny they could no longer control. Karma is quiet like that. It does not announce itself, it waits. My daughter came to see me a week later. She looked thinner, tired. She sat on my couch like a guest, unsure of her welcome. "He lied to me," she said suddenly, "about everything." I listened. I had learned how. She told me about the pressure, the fear of losing status, the way small compromises had grown into something unrecognizable. "I thought you were strong enough to land on your feet," she said. "I didn't think about what I was asking you to give up." I took a breath. "You didn't ask," I said gently. "You decided." She nodded. Tears followed. Real ones, the kind that come when denial finally collapses. "I did not say I told you so. I did not say you chose this. I said something harder. Now you know what it feels like to be excluded." That sentence stayed between us like a mirror. Over the next months, their marriage unraveled quietly. No shouting, no scenes, just distance and paperwork. The kind of ending that leaves behind more questions than answers. I helped where I could, with childcare, with listening, but I did not rescue. I had learned that lesson too well. One evening, as I walked home from the park, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting for my life to resume. It already had. The invitation arrived in a pale blue envelope. My granddaughter's second birthday. A small gathering. No church, no spectacle. I stood in my kitchen holding it, remembering the baptism day, the bells, the way my world had tilted. I decided to go. The party was simple. Balloons, cake, laughter that felt genuine, not performative. My daughter hugged me carefully as if afraid I might disappear again. Her husband was not there. During the party, another grandmother pulled me aside. She whispered, "You're brave." I smiled politely. People often mistake endurance for bravery. Later, as I watched my granddaughter chase bubbles across the yard, my daughter stood beside me. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how easily we forget who built the ground we stand on." I nodded. "We don't forget," I replied. "We choose what to honor." She looked at me then, really looked, not as a resource, not as a safety net, but as a woman with her own history. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," she said. "Neither do I answered. That night back in my quiet home, I reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the courtroom, the slow return of self-respect. Revenge is often imagined as something loud, explosive, but real revenge is quieter. It is refusing to disappear. It is standing still while others are forced to confront themselves. It is living well without apology. I invested the rest of my money into a small property outside town. Nothing grand, just enough land to feel the earth again under my hands. I planted vegetables. I watched things grow. Sometimes I spoke to my husband aloud as I worked. I told him I was all right, that I had protected what we built even when it came from those we loved most. I knew there were still chapters ahead. Healing is not linear. Relationships remain complicated, but I no longer feared the future. Because I had learned something too important to forget. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by respect, and respect once lost must be earned back honestly. I was no longer the woman who could be pushed aside quietly. I was the woman who survived it. The first snowfall came early that year. It covered the ground quietly, the way truth often does after a long season of noise. I watched it through my kitchen window, hands wrapped around a warm mug, thinking about how much my life had changed without ever fully stopping. My daughter and I were rebuilding something fragile. Not the past. That was gone. We were building a new understanding, one that did not rely on guilt or obligation. She came by once a week now, sometimes with my granddaughter, sometimes alone. We spoke honestly even when it was uncomfortable. One afternoon she brought documents with her, divorce papers. She did not cry this time. She looked tired but steadier. "I stayed longer than I should have," she said, "because I was afraid to start over." I nodded. Fear keeps people loyal to the wrong things. She looked at me, then eyes searching. "How did you do it?" I considered the question carefully. "I didn't do it all at once," I said. "I did it one boundary at a time." She smiled faintly. That answer mattered more than comfort ever could. Word of the court case continued to circulate quietly. Women my age began stopping me after volunteer shifts at the grocery store, even at church. They did not ask for details. They asked for reassurance. "I gave everything to my kids," one woman whispered, "and now they barely call." I listened. I always listened, but I never told them what to do. I only told them what I learned. Love should not require erasing yourself. Margaret invited me to lunch one day. She told me she had started referring to my case when younger clients came in, women who had been pressured into silence. "Your story gives them courage," she said. I thought about that on the drive home. Courage had never been my goal. Survival had been. But sometimes survival becomes an example whether you intend it or not. That winter, I hosted Thanksgiving for the first time in years. Nothing elaborate. A small table, a few neighbors. My daughter and granddaughter arrived early. My daughter helped in the kitchen the way she used to when she was young. As we ate, I realized something quietly extraordinary. I was not bracing myself. I was not shrinking. I was simply present. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone at the table and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Peace without conditions. Spring returned slowly, but it always does. I spent more time outside, hands in the soil, coaxing life from the ground the way I once had on the farm. I did not regret selling it anymore. I had honored what it gave me by protecting myself when it mattered most. My granddaughter turned 3 that year. She ran toward me without hesitation, arms open, laughter unguarded. Children remember how you make them feel, not the stories adults tell later. My daughter watched us from the porch, her face softer than it had been in years. She had started therapy. She talked about accountability now, about patterns, about learning instead of blaming. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said one afternoon, "just to stay." I looked at her carefully. "Staying doesn't mean surrendering," I replied. She nodded. She was finally listening. The house I lived in now was small, but it was mine in every way that mattered. No one could ask me to leave it. No one could rewrite my contribution. I had learned the value of security earned, not assumed. Sometimes late at night I thought back to the baptism. The bells, the church steps, the moment my life cracked open. If I could speak to the woman I was that day, I would tell her this. You are not being punished. You are being redirected. Betrayal has a way of clarifying what kindness alone cannot. It strips away illusion. It reveals who sees you as a person and who sees you as a resource. I no longer feared being alone. I feared only returning to silence. And so I spoke when something felt wrong. I asked questions. I read the fine print. I trusted my instincts again. That was the real inheritance I reclaimed. If you are listening to this and you recognize yourself somewhere in my story, know this. It is never too late to draw a line. It is never too late to demand fairness. And it is never selfish to protect the life you built with your own hands. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments and stay connected. Stories like these matter because they remind us that dignity is not given. It is claimed, and once you claim it, no one can take it away again.